Nowadays, contract killers seem to only exist in the movies, like the popular John Wick franchise. Whenever we hear about murder for hire plots in the modern news, it's usually exposed because the so-called assassin was either an informant or an undercover government agent. But maybe this line of business really does exist, and the successful operators get away with their illegal trade because it's so secretive, where the price for speaking out is death. That's what it was like for Murder Inc., an organized group of hitmen who did the dirty work for the Mafia in the 1930s, following the formation of the Commission by Lucky Luciano at the end of the Castellamarese War. Luciano turned bootlegger gangs into a complex organization, and the key component for making this all work was compartmentalization. Ideally, those who were committing crimes were isolated from those who were giving the orders, and Murder Inc. provided the perfect arrangement for Cosa Nostra and the new National Crime Syndicate. Murder Inc. was a name created by the press after the scope and scale of the crimes committed by this group were exposed, and while they might not have had a formal name amongst themselves, they were extremely organized, with estimates that they murdered between 400 and 1,000 people. The group contained a mix of Jewish and Italian gangsters, with those doing the killing not knowing the reason why their targets were marked for death. They were led by Louis Buchalter, who was known by the nickname of Lepke. Lepke Buchalter's contact in Cosa Nostra was Albert Anastasia, the then underboss of what would later be known as the Gambino crime family. The workflow for a hit was fairly simple. The commission, and sometimes individual bosses, would contact Anastasia to set up a murder. He would then funnel the job to Lepke Buchalter. Available hitmen would hang out in the back room of Midnight Rose's candy store in Brooklyn as they waited for jobs which Buchalter would assign through intermediaries like Mendy Weiss, who acted as a second-in-command in addition to being a prolific murderer. According to hitman turned informant Abe Reles, members of Murder Inc. would be paid between $1,000 and $5,000 per murder depending on the target and difficulty. In 2025 dollars, this is equal to between $20,000 and $100,000. Some members of the group were put on weekly salaries because they were reliable and highly skilled in their craft. Their methods for murder varied, but two of their favorite ways to kill someone was to either strangle them, as there was no noise and blood, while the other preferred tactic was to stab a victim through the ear with an ice pick. The reason for this was that inexperienced pathologists would sometimes mistake the cause of death as a brain aneurysm. While Lepke Buchalter might have been the boss of Murder Inc., the organization of this group of killers was looser than what could be found in Cosa Nostra. Many men would come and go as contract killers, but there were a few core guys during the 1930s. The group was a mix of Jewish gangsters and Italians, with most men not having 100% of their ancestry from the old country, which made them ineligible to become official members of the Mafia. Working under Buchalter was his lieutenant and top hitman Abe Reles, who would later become an informant that helped law enforcement destroy Murder Inc. He is estimated to have killed at least 40 people. Then there was the psychopath Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, who ended the lives of more than 100 people. Harry Happy Mayone was an Italian-American with at least 10 kills. He earned the nickname Happy because he would often break out into a huge smile after performing a kill. Frank the Dasher. Abondando was a charming womanizer with good looks who preferred to kill his estimated 30 victims with a knife. Charlie Workman was a professional hitman who was respected by his violent colleagues. His most famous kill was Jewish kingpin Dutch Schultz. Another prolific killer in this group was Mendy Weiss, who killed so many people that the real number will never be known. Vito Socco Guarino performed several murders and is believed to have later been inducted into the Mafia. Happy Mayone and Frank the Dasher are not believed to have ever been members of Cosa Nostra. The Mafia Commission was formed at the end of 1931 by Lucky Luciano, and with the help of his good friend Meyer Lansky, they organized what would become Murder, Inc. Once a hit on a target was sanctioned by the mob's leadership, the victim would be pointed out to his would-be killers, with the murder to take place a few days later. Because the victim had no association with his murderers, it was difficult for investigators to establish a motive, and for years, these homicides went unsolved. In many instances, the body would be buried, causing people to simply disappear, like labor organizer Pete Panto, who was killed by Mendy Weiss, while Albert Anastasia looked on. The early victims of this group were those who cooperated with law enforcement, small-time rival crooks, and disobedient union officials that posed a threat to the Mafia's labor rackets. The first major challenge for the National Crime Syndicate came in 1935, when Jewish gangster Dutch Schultz, whose organization was sometimes referred to as New York's Sixth Crime Family, approached the commission for sanctioning the murder of New York State Prosecutor Thomas Dewey. Dewey had prosecuted Dutch Schultz for tax evasion before, and it ended with a hung jury. There were accusations afterwards that jurors had been bribed, and Dewey prepared to bring the gangster back to court for a second trial. Schultz reasoned that the best way to deal with this relentless lawman was to kill him. Albert Anastasia himself stalked Dewey and reported back to the commission that they could easily murder him during his morning routine. The heads of the major families debated this and decided that if they killed Dewey, then the law enforcement response would crush them. Dutch Schultz's request was denied, but he vowed to proceed anyway. As a result, a contract was put out on him to prevent Dewey's murder. Charlie Workman and Mendy Weiss shot Schultz to death in a Newark restaurant. Ironically, Lucky Luciano, who played a pivotal role in preventing Dewey's murder, would later find himself in the prosecutor's crosshairs, where he would be sent to prison and eventually deported. Irving Puggy Feinstein was a degenerate gambler who got himself on the wrong side of Anastasia's boss, Vincent Mangano, when he opened an underground casino in that family's territory. He was abducted off the street when he went to pay off a loan shark. He was taken to Abe Reles' house, where he was tied up and strangled to death. His body was placed in a stolen car, dumped in a vacant lot, and then set on fire. Murder Inc.'s operations were not just limited to New York, and Lepke Buchalter also ordered murders directly without the commission's approval. Harry Greenberg, an associate of Bugsy Siegel, was suspected of cooperating with law enforcement. They killed him as a precaution. Joseph Rosen was a former garment unionist who had information that could have incriminated Buchalter in a labor racketeering case. He was murdered in 1936. Murder Inc.'s activities continued throughout the 1930s, but as the decade came to a close, law enforcement began to notice patterns across America's unsolved murders, and they began to zero in on the Brownsville crew of killers. The Mafia created an efficient system for taking out those they deemed to be rivals, but they were playing a game of chance, and their luck was now running out. Midnight, Rose's candy store began to be surveilled, and the hardened killers soon started to become paranoid. The breakthrough for detectives came when they arrested Abe Reles in 1940. He was picked up for the 1933 murder of a small-time gangster named Red Albert. The breakthrough for the case came when incarcerated, hitman Harry Rudolph gave the police testimony that he was a witness to the murder. And the more the cops looked into Reles, the more they suspected that he had been a key player in other unsolved gangland executions. Prior to his arrest, Reles plus Goldstein and Strauss had been in a rivalry with another Jewish gang led by the Shapiro brothers. The Shapiro brothers tried to ambush the trio, and they succeeded in wounding Goldstein and Strauss, but they didn't kill any of them. At the same time, they abducted Reles' girlfriend and Maya Shapiro tortured her. As they recovered from their wounds, Reles plotted revenge. First, he ambushed Irving Shapiro in his home, beat him, and dragged him to the street where he shot him multiple times. 2 months later, he met Maya Shapiro on the street and shot him in the face. The last Shapiro brother to go was William. He was abducted, taken to a hideout, beaten, and finally thrown in a sack. He was then driven to an already dug hole and was in the process of being buried when a car passed by and the killers ran. When William Shapiro's autopsy was performed, it was determined that he was buried alive and died from the suffocation. The police had a really strong case against Reles, and he was looking at the electric chair. To save himself, he became a government witness and told investigators about Murder Inc., the candy shop, and leader Lepke Buchalter's direct 1936 murder of Joseph Rosen. Frank the Dasher, Abandando, Happy Mayone, and Pittsburgh Phil Strauss were all tried together for the 1937 murder of George Rudnick. In May of 1940, they were found guilty thanks to Reles's testimony. The verdict was overturned, and in 1941, a second trial commenced where all three were found guilty of first-degree murder with a sentence of execution. Martin Bugsy Goldstein was also convicted for the Irving Feinstein murder with Pittsburgh Phil. They were both executed by the electric chair on June 12, 1941. Frank the Dasher and Happy Mayone met their ends on February 19, 1942. Lepke Buchalter was originally on the lam since 1937 for violating antitrust laws in relation to the fur industry where he controlled labor rackets. As the police were closing in on Murder Inc. before Reles flipped, a reward was placed on him in 1939 for his role in unsolved gangland killings. At the urging of Albert Anastasia, who promised that the Mafia would get him a great lawyer and make bribes to judges to make this trouble disappear, Buchalter surrendered to FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover in front of a Manhattan hotel on August 24, 1939. It turned out that he had been hiding in New York the entire time. Anastasia's promise to make Buchalter's legal problems disappear was a false hope. First, he was convicted of federal narcotics trafficking, and then he was turned over to New York State to answer charges in regards to labor racketeering. He was sentenced to 30 years, but was then transferred to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary to serve 14 years for his federal charges first. But with Reles's testimony, Buchalter and Mendy Weiss found themselves indicted for the 1936 murder of Joseph Rosen. They, along with another hitman named Louis Capone, were all found guilty and sentenced to death. After exhausting their appeals, the trio were brought to Sing Sing State Prison. Capone and Weiss were killed first. Finally, Buchalter was placed on the electric chair and declined to say any final words. He is the only mob boss to have met his end with the death penalty administered by the government, but prosecutors were not done with their takedown of Murder Inc. after Buchalter's capture and conviction. Through Reles, they learned about the man who controlled his boss, Albert Anastasia. With the turncoat's information, they learned that Anastasia was there when longshoreman and labor activist Pete Panto was murdered by Mendy Weiss in 1939. A trial charging Anastasia with the murder was set to begin on November 12, 1941, with Reles serving as the star witness. But on the early morning of the first scheduled day of the trial, Reles was found dead. He was under police guard at a Coney Island motel and fell to his death from the window without anyone noticing. 2 sheets were tied to a radiator, and the official story was that he must have tried to climb out and escape his protection, despite the length of the tied sheets not being long enough to get him even halfway to the ground. The press called Reles the canary who could sing, but couldn't fly. Without his testimony, the case against Anastasia fell apart, but the high-ranking Cosa Nostra member was now on law enforcement's radar, and the publicity from the trial that did not happen turned him into a household name. With Murder, Inc. officially destroyed, the Mafia families were forced to take care of their own needs for violence themselves. But this was hardly a problem for them, especially since committing murder is a key requirement towards one becoming qualified to become an official member of Cosa Nostra. The power of the Jewish gangsters began to decline in the 1940s, and in the aftermath of World War II they started to disappear. In contrast, Cosa Nostra was in a golden age that lasted well into the 1980s, with the Mafia still existing today.